Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for coming in
Yeah.
on this pre-Diwali evening in Delhi. My name is Orgo Sengupta and I'm the Research Director at the Vidhi Center. And I'm delighted today to be moderating Vidhi's 10th Book Adda. And it's a very, very special book. It's a special book for a number of reasons, because it's not often that you have someone who is so close to
Actually, you
the
stay in
echelons.
DC proper.
Can you hear us, Justice Sri Krishna?
You stay in DC proper.
Can we mute them for the moment? Yeah,
I think they can hear us.
yeah. Sorry about that. This is a hybrid mode, and so there are some perils of the hybrid mode. But Justice Sri Krishna, we will unmute you when the time is right, and don't worry about that. So, as I was saying, Prachi, can you hear us clearly, or should we try and make this volume a bit louder?
No,
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Okay, we'll sort this out in the next 5 to 7 minutes, so I don't
We
think
can't follow what you're saying.
Okay, I'll try and speak a bit louder, but I think we will, I'll ask the technicians to please sort this out in the next 5 to 7 minutes. Because we don't think we can make our volume any louder here, because it will become very loud in this room. But as I was saying, that this book is a very special book. And it's special for a number of reasons, the most important being that, for me at least, as in it's not very often that you have someone who has a real insight into the echelons of governance and power, who has spoken so candidly on his time in power, as well as on the cusp of it. But having said that, Mr. N.K. Singh, the author of the book, is no ordinary civil servant. He, of course, comes from a very illustrious family, so he had to outshine both his parents, one of whom was an outstanding civil servant himself, and his mother a two-term MP from Purnia. So it was no mean feat. He had his task cut out right from the beginning, but he managed to do it with aplomb over a period of time. A personal anecdote: I first heard of Mr. N.K. Singh from my mentor, Mr. Arun Jaitley, who told me, and maybe I haven't told you this, Mr. Singh, he quipped to me, and he said with a twinkle in his eye, that for Nandu Babu, life begins at 60. So I think we are the beneficiaries of the fact that as he has turned 20, he has written this book with his insights from his decades of experience in government. So thank you very much, Mr. Singh, for writing this book and getting select insights from Dr. PK Mishra. It was a real wonderful read, and welcome to Vidhi. We are also delighted to have on Zoom, please, Dr. Pandey. We are also delighted to have on Zoom another sprightly 20-year-old, Justice B.N. Sri Krishna. I've often remarked to Justice Sri Krishna that if I were to have half his energy and a quarter of his zeal for life at the age of 80, then I would consider myself very fortunate. Justice Sri Krishna is, of course, a former judge of the Supreme Court of India and a leading public intellectual. Justice Sri Krishna, thank you very much for joining us from Bombay today.
You're welcome for whatever you're saying.
Also joining us on Zoom from a more chilly Vienna is Prachi Mishra. Prachi is a senior economist at the IMF, earlier with the Ministry of Finance. She has been a co-conspirator with Mr. Singh on many of his assignments, including his latest stint with the Finance Commission and the FRBM Committee. And Prachi, thanks very much for joining us from Vienna.
Thank you, Argu, my pleasure.
It's great. And here with us in person, we have Dr. Indu Bhushan. Dr. Indu Bhushan was most recently the former CEO of the National Health Authority and in charge of the ambitious Ayushman Bharat program. He also holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins and has earlier worked with the World Bank and the IMF, World Bank and the ADB, and was an Indian Administrative Service officer for a few years before that. Of course, the least known and the best kept secret in his CV is the fact that he's also a director and board member at Vidhi. Thank you very much, Dr. Bhushan, for joining us. And last but not the least, as in we have Dr. Ajay Bhushan Pandey. I can safely say that if there is one civil servant I have worked with most in the last 10 years of Vidhi, it's been Dr. Pandey. And sometimes in a lighter vein, my wife had quipped to me that if we look at our call records, it will seem like I'm married to Dr. Pandey and not her. But he has inimitable energy. He's now the chairperson of the National Financial Reporting Authority. He has earlier been Revenue Secretary and Finance Secretary in the Government of India, the CEO of the UIDAI as well. Thank you very much, Dr. Pandey, for joining us. And thank you very much to the audience for joining us today and our sign language interpreters for doing what you do every time. So without any further ado, Mr. Singh, I'll jump straight into the book. If I were to summarize the book in one line, I would say that it's from LK to NK to PK. You talk about LK Jha, who was in the Prime Minister's office in the 1960s, first with Lal Bahadur Shastri and then with Indira Gandhi. You yourself served with Mr. Vajpayee with great distinction. And now Dr. PK Mishra. You're the bridge that connects these three. So could you tell us a little bit about how you have seen the nature of the Prime Minister's office changing over the course of these 6 or 7 decades? So.
Well, thank you very much, first Argha, for arranging this Adda. I recognize that this is the 10th Adda which you are having, and I'm indeed privileged that you found the time to have this interaction with the younger generation, who indeed, which indicates really the vibrancy of Vidhi as a legal institution. On another anecdotal note, before I delve into your question, is what late Mr. Arun Jaitley had told me about you, and told me that N.K. Babu, if you ever need top-class legal advice on complex issues, I would strongly recommend you go to Argha. By the way, Arunji, as I knew him for decades, was not given to making light-hearted remarks when it came to. So there were only 2 legal people about which he mentioned to me. One was you, and the other was the distinguished 93-year-old man, I'll leave you to guess, based in Chennai, which he told me that in case you could ever persuade him to give you advice, you can't do it any better. And he, of course, spurned me when I sought any advice from him. But in the end, he also, I was privileged to receive his advice. I must also add, Argha, that during my period as the chairman of the Fiscal Responsibility Management Committee, I often turned to you for complex advice on fiscal issues and fiscal-related issues. The 2 other panelists which you have on your side, Idhu was of great assistance to me in the Finance Commission, and I must record my gratitude to him since I have not met him since then. And of course with my colleague on the left, who held the same position which I did much earlier than him. He was of such enormous help to me in my interactions with the Ministry of Finance. So I'm grateful to him particularly for all the help. Prachi has been of great assistance to me in multiple stages of some of this work which I have done, particularly in the FRBM committee, and subsequently serving on the advisory board of the 15th Finance Commission, and has continued to be a vibrant writer. Now, Prachi, to some extent, is slightly biased when it comes to this book, because whether she does or not,
I can't hear a word.
whether she does or not, I will disclose.
And they're muted also.
Mute करके रखा है. Please unmute कीजिए.
Is this all right?
Yeah, I think it's okay.
I must disclose on behalf of Prachi that her views on this book may be already tinged by the fact that she has written a rather erudite review of this book in one of the more well-known newspapers in this country, and Prachi has therefore read this book with amazing diligence. But Justice Ramakrishna, what can I say except to say that we stand in awe of your understanding on complex financial issues. Indeed, the recommendations of your committee's report form the basic architecture of the financial reform strategy, which we are halfway or less than halfway, more or less complete. So I stand in great awe of your legal understanding, particularly on complex economic and financial issues, some of which I have per se touched on. Now to your question, Argha. Well, I must point out that that part of it, the anecdotal part of it, on the evolution of the Prime Minister's office has not been extensively covered in this particular chapter which I have written in this book, but it has been covered more extensively in my autobiography, which came out about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And therefore, let me begin with that anecdote which I have recited in my autobiography before I come to address this sharp question which you have asked. In the book in my autobiography, I do recount the fact that Mr. N.K. Jha, who was a colleague of my father, they had both studied together in England, my father at the London School, N.K. Jha at Cambridge, and they were both belonging to the same cadre, namely the Bihar cadre, and Mr. N.K. Jha and my father, we were neighbors in Patna till he chose to come away to Delhi. And when my father was Secretary Planning Commission, N.K. Jha was Secretary Economic Affairs. Then suddenly there was a change of government, and the somewhat demure Lal Bahadur Shastri became the Prime Minister of India. Among his first decisions was to change the character of the Prime Minister's office. For him, as I have mentioned, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru did not have a Prime Minister's office. He was, as described by some of the anecdotes of that time, wanted to really have a very small office, the main assignment being driven by the Cabinet Office itself. And incidentally, I don't know if I have mentioned in this book, Lord Wavell, in one of his correspondence which he had, writes that I have done this deliberately so that Jawaharlal does not go off at a tangent and the integrity of the institutions of the Cabinet Office and the Prime Minister's office is being maintained and observed all the time. Now, all this underwent a dramatic change when Lal Bahadur Shastri became the Prime Minister, because he appointed for the first time N.K. Jha, a distinguished civil servant and a distinguished economist, as the first secretary to the Prime Minister. N.K. Jha, being N.K. Jha, a man of great intelligence, he said he will not undertake this responsibility till the rules of transaction of business under which governments and government institutions function, notified by the President, has a new insertion, namely that was the first time that an insert under the rules of transaction of business was made, which said Prime Minister's office, and then it describes the function of the Prime Minister's office to assist the Prime Minister in the discharge and so on and so forth. So that was the first time that it happened. And my father jocularly had, I remember, while congratulating late N.K. Jha, had told him that it was a historic day because the character of the Indian civil service and governance architecture had been changed decisively and permanently. And then N.K. asked my father the question, why do you say so? And he had a very simple, if I may say so, since you are also from Bihar, Ajay, my father jocularly remarked to him, well, stop being kidding. Till last night, what was the last note that the Prime Minister would have read that note would have been from the Cabinet Secretary. From tonight, what is the last note that the Prime Minister will read, not the Cabinet Secretary's note, but your note based on whatever Cabinet Secretary has said? Doesn't this make a change in the rubric of the governance process itself? That's how it all began.
That's right.
And then it gathered momentum because N.K. Jha was pushed out to become the governor of the Reserve Bank because it was at that time felt that he had views which were far too modern by those standards, and Mrs. Indira Gandhi's dependence on the left increased rather significantly. He was succeeded by Parmeshwar Narayan Haksa, another brilliant intellectual with strong leftist ideological leanings. And that changed the Prime Minister's office from being a mere neutral institution to one which began to represent a certain ideological focus in the quality of advice which the Prime Minister received. And that reflected itself on some of the economic and measures which were adopted at that point in time. Since then, of course, the Prime Minister's office has been evolving, changing, and adapting. You asked about the bridge. The bridge was that I had the privilege to serve with late Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, a man of remarkable understanding, a person with great vision. And as I have recited, perhaps in my autobiography, that when I had the audacity to once ask Mr. Vajpayee, when I joined as his secretary, on what was the work that he intended me to do, his eyes characteristically wandered, and he said only one word, and that was in Hindi. He said, "Sab kuch." And I wondered what the "sab kuch" remark meant, till I understood that everything perhaps, and then he added that since his economic understanding on complex issues were nothing about which he could boast about, he perhaps expected my advice on all economic issues, which was really one style of doing it in which the Prime Minister took the great decisions. And then since then, of course, the period of Dr. Manmohan Singh, there was a period of 10 years during that period, and it was Dr. Manmohan Singh who had really, in many ways, been the architect of India's economic reforms, although people must realize that rightly Dr. Manmohan Singh had the vision, but of course, it's the Prime Minister who supported him absolutely to take those difficult decisions. P.V. Narasimha Rao, who had not received the kind of recognition for the initiation of India's economic reforms, deserves much more credit, and so on. So, and of course, it was under Dr. Manmohan Singh as Prime Minister, where some of the reforms begun by him as Finance Minister needed much greater traction than we saw during that period. And many have therefore, Arga, sought to compare that Manmohan Singh as Finance Minister versus Manmohan Singh as Prime Minister, and what represented the asymmetry during that period. And you have, of course, now followed by a period of very strong leadership who is not in any way hesitant in taking difficult decisions with panache and with a degree of political authority which India has not seen for a very long time. This has really enabled some very difficult economic decisions to be taken, which had languished for a very long time. Indeed, more recently, when you look at the pandemic, he made that famous statement that one must always convert a challenge into an opportunity. The challenge of the pandemic being converted into an opportunity of completing the more difficult economic reform agenda, particularly representing the factors of production, of land, labor, capital, which are now taken for granted, but then proceeding forward on some very, very important decisions on the governance architecture itself. So, in one line, if I may say so, how do I see the relationship between the Cabinet Office and the Prime Minister's office? And this would be my response. That one-line response is, the Cabinet Office represents stability, the Prime Minister's office represents change. One is a catalyst for continuity of institutions. The other is a catalyst for bringing about changes which would bring about a translation of the vision of the Prime Minister which he is expected to carry. So both of them are two sides of the scale. You need both stability and you need change. And therefore the question of whether the cabinet office should be folded into the Prime Minister's office, my response would be certainly not. It requires stability with change, but with change you also require stability. I'll stop here.
No, that's great, Mr. Singh. There's a lot of things to unpack there, but I'll take two more opening comments from you on two parts of your book that I found fascinating before I turn to the others on the panel. And the first is something that you adverted to, which I got a sense in the book, is that the bureaucracy is the deep state of Indian policy making, right? It is the stable backbone in some sense. And there was a kind of thread running through that, both through your essays and Dr. PK Mishra's. And in that context, I wanted to ask you, given your journey both as a serving bureaucrat and then post-retirement, how do you see the nature of policy making in India, lawmaking, having changed over a period of time? You in your book suggest that there need to be several reforms. For example, there is a pretty radical reform that you suggest in the Ministry of Finance, where you have served yourself. How do you think the nature of policy making has changed over time? And what do you think we need to do to reform so that we can keep up with these changes?
So I think that's a very complex question. Because let us not forget, Argha, that we are talking of India, yes, as one country, but it is a functioning federal democracy. And that the states in India enjoy and rightly exercise under the Constitution powers which are assigned to them. The bureaucrat who serves with great diligence as perhaps a district magistrate of Pune, which you mentioned in my mother's case, or perhaps from Kota, from where Ambassador Kunari comes and sister. But that same district magistrate must inevitably rise up to serve the difficult challenge of being the revenue secretary, which he served with great distinction for a number of years and which I had privilege. So the kind of domain knowledge which you require of a managerial skill to manage floods, manage riots, manage security issues, bring about developmental challenges at the grassroots level must exhibit the same kind of domain knowledge in the multiple responsibilities which is expected to serve in the Secretariat of the state and more intricate ways with the central government. Is the present situation ideal and optimum? Perhaps not, because it's difficult to combine refreshing of domain knowledge with the need to ensure that some of these basic managerial functions are not discharged very seriously. One of the things which should be done more creatively is, I think, lateral inductions. And I think that that has been a stalled economic reforms. So when some young IAS officers come to ask me my advice, and since he did this enormous work, Indu did this enormous work on putting this health initiative, the Ayushman initiative, into place. I would say this, that to any young IAS officer, do not forget your domain knowledge and understanding. Keep refreshing it. One day it could become of great value to it. To a person handling economics and complex financial issues, deepening understanding of the literature on economics would be of great help. So I would say lateral change, lateral induction, and the government itself wanting to use the domain skills in a more creative way is one kind of a reform which would be possible. The second is the complex management of the relationship between the political executive and the bureaucracy. Now, we have the bureaucrat, but he's politically neutral because he has been assigned the responsibility to carry forward the policies of the government of that day, and he must do so with great inevitability. Of course, before the policy is adopted, He has every right to explain to the political executive the pros and cons, to the merits of the decisions being undertaken. But once a decision has been undertaken, he must really carry those decisions as diligently as possible. Are these easy? Is the management of institutional continuity, stability, adherence to rules and regulations easy enough to combine with alacrity of functions in its implementation? I would say it's a constant challenge which a successful bureaucrat must constantly overcome in order to improve his performances and meet the expectations of the political executive as much as to meet his own expectations, or doing so in consonance with the national good.
No, that's great. And I think that is a nice segue into my third question, which is something that your book deals with in great detail, which is a chapter titled Federalism in Flux. The fact of the matter is, as you said, that India is a functioning federation. States are sovereign in their own respects, as the union government also is. Now, my question to you, therefore, is that given the fact that there are some areas, which in your book you also suggest that there needs to be uniformity across. So, for example, whether it be public health, as drug regulation, these are good areas where we want the same standards across the country. But at the same time, Dr. PK Mishra's chapters point to the fact as to how important good decentralized administration is to a well-functioning nation. And he says that that's one of the main reasons why Gujarat is a successful state, because of what he calls the social milieu, which includes proactive participation by people in grassroots democracy. So my question to you is that how do you see this growth of federalism? Because at one side we want strong local governments, but at the other side we also want a strong union. So where do you see the balance between these two pulls?
So I think that as long as the letter and spirit of the Constitution is respected, there should be, broadly speaking, harmony between a strong center and well-functioning federal entities. Yes, Arga, who knows better than you and Justice Ramakrishna, that India is a union. It is a federation of states. It is not a confederation of states. It is a federation because it is not a question of coming together. It's a question of holding together. The federal entities can be subdivided into bits and parts, but the union as a whole must remain intact. So that is the broad architecture which would then enable us to understand the working of new federal institutions, the most recent being the GST Council, with which Pandey dealt with at great length during his period as Revenue Secretary. These are things still in evolution, and a working federation is constantly in evolution. The question is, the states always get the feeling as
I think it's Justice Sri Krishna.
Don't talk to me now. I'm in the middle of a conversation.
Some issue there. Sorry about that. Yeah, please go ahead.
All right. So I think that I will say that there are challenges in an even more harmonious relationship between the center and the states. As chairman of the Finance Commission, I had the privilege to visit all the states in India. The states always get the impression that not enough devolution is being made. These are being dealt with in the Finance Commission. The central government always gets the feeling that perhaps far too much has been given to the states, and they are not necessarily in the most enviable position to make the most optimal use of precious natural resources which are available within the bounds of fiscal parameters and overall macroeconomic stability. What more needs and can be done to improve center-state relations? It's a much broader issue. One of the things which I have pleaded for, and I will plead again at the risk of repetition, is that we need to revisit, and who better than Justice Ramakrishna, the 7th schedule of the Constitution, Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3 of the Constitution. Part 1 dealing with the functions of the Union, Part 2 dealing with the functions of the state, Part 3 the concurrent list. This has become over time anachronistic, as many of these subjects assigned to list 1, 2, and 3 have become very fungible. And often you get the impression that this is the subject which, why is the central government having the centrally sponsored schemes? This is a subject in the domain of the states. And the states often get the feeling that the central government is encroaching on those resources. And yet the states want centrally sponsored schemes. Right. So you have on the one hand centrally sponsored schemes which look to be opaque in terms of list 1, 2, or 3. You also, in order to complicate life, have standalone legislations by Parliament which to some extent complicate the picture. You have the Right to Education Act, which is a standalone legislation. You have really a stand-alone in terms of, apart from education, you have other stand-alone in terms of food security. You have many other subjects where stand-alone legislations and the existence of part 1, 2, and 3 list in the Constitution needs to be holistically visited, in my view, for greater trust to be built between center and the states as India becomes increasingly more and more interdependent. And let us not forget one final comment, that a lot of this distinction is anachronistic. Because today, technology does not understand distinctions or boundaries drawn up with a certain conceived. Look at the power which the adoption of 5G artificial intelligence does in terms of changing the nature of agricultural activity, education, health, the way in which education is being imparted, health services can be given, and making consistent with a world where renewable energy and environment is a constant challenge which humanity must successfully overcome in order to enable this planet to become livable.
No, that's great. And I think this is a great question to take to Justice Sri Krishna. I don't know whether we've sorted that out, but if we haven't sorted it out, whoever's handling it, if you could type out the question, because I think we can hear them very clearly. It's just this way that the audio has some issue. Justice Sri Krishna, Mr. N.K. Singh just spoke about, and he's written about in his book as well, how the 7th schedule requires revisiting. And I think a lot of us felt during the pandemic as well, that there were certain questions relating to what the center would do and what the states would do. So, for example, the states were clamoring for procuring vaccines. And when the center did give it to them, the fact is that the state got no bidders because they were not competitive. So the question that really arises is, how do we look at reviewing the 7th schedule of the Constitution? Justice Sri Krishna, if you can hear us, we can hear you. Yes, we can hear you.
I confess that I couldn't hear what was being spoken earlier, but I did hear your question.
Okay, that's great. So we've sorted it out.
Okay.
All right. Better late than never.
So this will be some kind of an exclusive monologue on my part, because I am not part of the debate. I'm just hearing a question and answering it. Anyway,
and so
look, as far as the constitutional issue is concerned, there is a clearly demarcated line between what is policy and what is infringement of a fundamental right. Way back in the Davis case, Justice Holmes said that you must allow certain play of joints for the executive or the policy. Now, where does the policy stop and where does the breach of fundamental rights begin is always a delicate task. Okay. Where does the policy stop and where does it infringe the fundamental right is a very delicate task, and rightly it has been entrusted to the judiciary. Now, it's possible that under the guise, why is it that the question of fundamental rights is so important? If the legislature has been asked to work within a certain perimeter, obviously the legislature cannot ask the executive to execute a policy which goes beyond the perimeter. First of all, the legislative subjects are indicated somewhat broadly in the 3 schedules. Now the schedules are indicative of the subject. Now, what can legitimately fall within the subject, if it is a peripheral issue, how much of it can fall within or without, is a matter of a lot of debate and has been the subject matter of so many decisions, both of the Privy Council, the House of Lords, and the Australian High Court, the Canadian Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, and the Indian Supreme Court. Now, the question is, how do you really ascertain that this is not an infringement of the fundamental right? Now, the fundamental right, at least Article 19, has given an open valve for this kind of a restriction. Sub-article 2 gives certain joint in the play that yes, even if the legislature wants to implement a public policy, if it is for the specified reasons A, B, C, D, E that are enumerated in the sub-article 2, it's possible for the judge to say, hey, I'm not going to interfere with it because I'm satisfied that on an overall examination of the legislature, the policy appears to be very much in support of what is articulated in sub-article 2. Now, when it comes to a question of policy by executive, the test is somewhat more rigorous because then the test will be a dual test. Has the legislative really given this much of delegated power to the executive? And next question is, one step backwards, does the legislative really have this much of play in the joints? If these two are answered, I don't think there is much difficulty. Now, you talked of what happened during the COVID. I will give you an example of what happened. See, and during the COVID, there were only 2 legislations that were brought to the fore. One was the Disaster Management Act and the disaster, and the other was some Epidemics Act. Now, if you remember, the Arogya Setu was brought about not by a legislative enactment, but by some who thought that it was necessary, and it was necessary to be compulsorily imposed on every citizen and resident of this country. Now, when this was brought to my knowledge, I asked a fundamental question and said, what is the policy under which this has been done? Where is the policy articulated? What is the purpose for which it is being done? Now, none of the questions were satisfactorily answered, and therefore I boldly asserted and said, this is wholly unconstitutional. And lo and behold, the next day, this mandatory nature was reversed, and the government said, it is optional. See, that is the reason why I'm saying that it is necessary to examine it. Look, I'm sorry to say this, there used to be debate in the parliament. There used to be articulation of the purpose for which the law was being done. Do we have it today? If we don't have it today, then where is the articulation coming elsewhere?
That's right.
You don't expect the executive to articulate it in the secretarial chambers. The articulation of the policy must really be set forth in the parliamentary legislation after full debate. After all, you have to go that the law is intended for the citizens and not vice versa. All law, all invention, all science, all technologies should be centered around the human being. Now, anything that is not so, I'm sorry to say, must necessarily be looked at askance by the judiciary, which is supposed to be impartial.
Thank you.
I remember a very recent judgment of Justice Chandrachud, both in the Puttaswamy and in 2021 also, where he has again reiterated all this, where the articulation of the play in the joints policy, right from Justice Holmes to Justice Venkatachalaya all the way down. And he upheld a Tamil Nadu scheme for rendering help to the affected farmers. Now, it is possible that you satisfy a court which looks at it impartially, that it is necessary not to interfere with it. The court will not interfere. If you look at the number of judgments that have been upheld, even very conservative judges have said you must defer as far as the question of economic policies are concerned, health is concerned. Broadly, you should defer to the policy of the legislature as articulated in the executive policy. But if it infringes on the fundamental rights, that is a taboo which the judge must necessarily, at that point of time, raise a red flag. That is really the legal issue, the constitutional issue. Elsewhere, it's a question of what is best that is in the interest of the people of the country. That's my take on the whole issue. I'm sorry, it has become a monologue because I couldn't clearly hear what is being articulated in the debate. What we need really is perhaps a recalibration of your audio system, Mr. Sen Gupta. You are not only look at the recalibration of the book, but recalibrate your audio system next time.
Thank you. We'll certainly take that feedback very literally. But I think there is a point there in terms of the fact that there needs to be a degree of reform to our institutions. And I think that's a key takeaway. And if I could take that to you, Dr. Bhushan, the fact is that, and two parts. One is, I do want you to focus on this question of public health as this is your area of expertise. In terms of public health and federalism, is it your view that perhaps it's time to think about making public health a concurrent list subject? Like education was moved to the concurrent list by Mrs. Gandhi, and public health could be an area which the pandemic has shown is something where, is one of these concrete areas where federalism needs to perhaps be rejigged. And second, in relation to that, is Mr. Singh's book talks in great detail about reform within government, and also talks about the relationship between politician and bureaucrat. If I could ask you very briefly about your views, having read the book, on these two issues, and then I can take that to Dr. Pandey.
So thank you very much, Arghyo. First of all, for inviting me to share the dais with Mr. N.K. Singh, who's been someone that we've been looking up to for last 4 decades. Sir, you of course will not remember, but in 1990, you had come to Rajasthan, and our Chief Secretary, Mr. VBL Mathur, had organized a dinner for you in his lawn behind his bungalow, and he had invited some young officers, and like rock stars, we surrounded you and were asking different questions. And of course, what you've done since then, despite the fact that we didn't have social media and we knew what exactly you were doing, sir. So it's a great honor, and it was really a pleasure to read your book, and very insightful, and every chapter gave me some new information, and so I've actually read some of these chapters more than once, just to understand the depth that they had. And actually, I liked your introduction also very much, as you said, the scene that what is changing right now, and the fact that I think for the first time in last 80 years, we've actually gone backwards. In some cases, backwards by 2 years, 3 years, in some cases by more than a decade, in some cases more than 30 years. We've health life expectancy has gone down by more than 2 years. It's never happened before. Of course, our GDP has gone back by 2 years. Poverty, we've lost about 5 years. SDG, we have almost lost a decade. And in terms of inequalities, they've really increased. And I don't know if they have become systemic and deep-rooted, and if we can reverse them. And in terms of globalization, in terms of international relations, in terms of re-emergence of Cold War, in terms of the international architecture which was put in place very painstakingly in last 70, 80 years, there have been some pushback, and we are going back. So coming to health, I think 2 things which I really liked in your book, which you mentioned very clearly, is one is looking at laws and rewriting them, and it's a matter of shame that we have to rely on colonial age 1897, more than 120 years old law for Epidemic Act to address the problem of today. And so looking at that, and also the fact that you mentioned the recommendation of Raja Munnar committee and looking at Schedule 7 and looking at that. And we've had some discussion on health, where it should be. Of course, health appears in all three, if you look at it, because health, medical education is in list 1, public health, sanitation, hospitals and dispensary is in Schedule 2, and then Schedule 3 has things like drug control and other things under Schedule 3. I think there is a need again to look at all those and see where they should be. But I actually, in terms of public health, I just wanted to make 4 points. One is the issue that you very clearly mentioned, sir, is that we should increase the budget for health to 2.5% of GDP. But that issue is not new. We've been talking about this for last 20 years. There was the Macroeconomic and Health Commission, actually that recommended increasing the budget to 3%. And it has not happened in last 20 years. And even after health policy of 2017, which also recommended this, that has not happened. And the numbers which have come out, actually we are going in the reverse direction. The budget for health has gone down. And if you look at it, that recommendation, is it feasible to increase it to 2.5% by 2025? My humble submission is that it is not, because even if our GDP doesn't grow at all, of course we are expecting it to grow by 7%, we have to increase the budget by 30%, 35% to match that. And since almost it's a zero-sum game, if we increase budget by 30% for health, where else are we going to cut it? So that's one. Second is that center is only part of the puzzle. 2/3 of the budget for health comes from states. And states, because of the work that you've done on FRMBM, are under stress to keep their deficit to 3% of 4% of GDP. And so where will they get money? Because right now they're spending only between 4 and 5% of state GDP, and although the target is 8%, again they're facing the same thing, same problem. Third problem that we've seen, and very clearly, and we have some papers on that, is that whenever central government increases budget for anything, any subject in the health, instead of corresponding budget being increased in state, there is a substitution effect. And the same thing, for example, happened in Ayushman Bharat. Some of the states already had schemes like Ayushman Bharat. So as soon as the budget for Ayushman Bharat came, they had reduced that budget, and so it was almost like a substitution. There was no additionality. Third thing that we had seen was that strong states and relatively better off states are doing actually much better. They're gaining much more from centrally sponsored scheme for 2 reasons. One, they are the one who can provide the counterpart funds, 70%, 30%, so they can put the money on the table, and the budget releases are much better. Secondly, their absorptive capacity is much better. If, at least for Ayushman Bharat, we'd seen that they had the tertiary hospitals, they had the hospitals where they could use the money, and so in terms of uptake, all the southern states, per capita uptake of Ayushman Bharat was at least 3 or 4 times of that of UP and Bihar. So this was actually increasing the inequities between better off states and the poorer states. Now, second issue that I want to focus on is that, of course, we need more money, and it will be great if we can put 2.5%, but we can do much better with the existing money as well. And if we look at the allocation of money right now, it's it's bizarre, because non-communicable diseases, they get about less than 2% of the entire allocation. But we know that non-communicable diseases now account for more than 50% of burden of disease, and over time they're increasing. So instead of increasing budget for non-communicable diseases, we have been actually, in comparison, communicable diseases get about 4 times, 5 times more than that. So this is historical because we've been working on these vertical programs on malaria, TB, HIV, AIDS, and since they have strong lobbies, so they get much more money, and it's not a zero-based budgeting, so it comes from historical allocation. And non-communicable diseases don't have institutions like communicable diseases, so its budget is lower. Similarly, the budget going for urban health is much lower as compared to rural health, although 30% people live in urban areas, and in terms of primary care. So I think that's one major issue. Third issue that I want to bring in is about the regulation of private sector and the fact that we've been giving very small amount of money from government. Government budget has been low, and it's low actually globally. Out of 191 countries for which we have data, India is at 181. So we are actually in bottom 5 percentile in terms of the amount of money we are giving from government for health. So what has happened? Because government is not putting in money, private sector has filled that vacuum, and more than 70% of services in India are being provided by the private sector. And because of that, of course, both in rural areas, urban areas, private sector is there, and there's a need for regulating the quality of those. There's a need for regulating the quality of human resources, there's a need for regulating the quality of drugs and devices, there's a need for regulating quality of services. And all three, we don't have effective regulations and laws, we don't have effective institutions, and we don't have the capacity to regulate.
That's
so all three need to be done. My final point on health was health ministry. Sir, you said that Ministry of Finance requires reform. I think more than Ministry of Finance, it's Ministry of Health. If you look at Ministry of Health, sir, it's a combination of Ministry plus RBI plus SEBI plus IRDA plus Board of Direct Taxes all in one. They don't have those institutions like Ministry of Finance has, which are strong and doing regulations. Ministry does policy making, they implement schemes, they run a national health mission, they also do all the regulations because there is no arm's length regulator there who's doing the regulation. Right now in Ministry of Health, there is one special secretary, 7 additional secretaries, and number of joint secretaries, and I don't know how health secretary even remembers the name of all the joint secretaries and deputy secretaries, because it's so big. It's, I think, after probably Home Ministry is the largest ministry right now. So there is a need for looking at the ministry and defining the role of the ministry and accordingly making the...
So I'll take that. I know that you have many other thoughts, but I'll take, since we are on this question of reform, I think it would be a good segue to Dr. Pandey.
I have something else, so you have to come back to the...
I certainly will. Certainly will. But I want to get Dr. Pandey and Prachi in, and then we can have a discussion for about half an hour. So Dr. Pandey, as you, of course, most recently served as Finance Secretary to the Government of India. Mr. Singh in his book talks about a radical overhaul of the Finance Ministry, saying that expenditure should not be part of a Finance Ministry at this point of time. We need a Office of Budget Management kind of institution. What is your view in terms of reforms that you think governance machinery could do with to keep up with the times?
Yeah, first of all, it is my privilege to be here at this Adda. So thank you, Argo, for, it's like coming here in our old company, because I've worked so closely with you and with Mr. N.K. Singh, the Finance Commission, and not only that, he mentioned that he used to be my predecessor almost more than 2 decades back. I used to look up to him, and his father was another 3 decades earlier. So almost 50 years time span, and he too was Revenue Secretary. So in fact, sir, you may not know that many of these schemes that he had implemented during his time, and without taking his permission copyright, because many times when I used to be confronted with certain problems, I should look up and say, okay, what would N.K. Singh would have done? And then I looked at some old records, because somehow the government of India has a system, particularly in the Ministry of Finance, that you can locate those old records. And then we said that, look, this is what N.K. Singh has done. Now the 20 years have passed, and can we, make some changes and do something that. So in fact, one of the issues was that, the massive tendency of various disputes, tax disputes, in all levels of the court. Tribunal, High Court, Supreme Courts, more than 5 lakh cases were pending. And the total amount was anyone's guess. Someday, my people would say that 10 lakh crores, someday it will become 15 lakh crores. The question was, and those cases were pending for years together. So I said, last time, when was this any kind of a dispute resolution scheme was brought? And I said that during NK Singh tenure, this Kar Samadhan scheme, sir, you may recall. So that was done, and then the next one was done in 2016. The 2016, that dispute resolution scheme perhaps was not successful. So I had 2 learnings, and then in 2020, we brought this Vivad Se Vishwas scheme. That became hugely successful. Within few months, we could resolve dispute up to 1.5 lakh crores, finally. And more than 1 lakh cases were resolved. So that was a kind of a success. So that, your copyright, the copyright. Then another area where, we worked very closely was when he was in Finance Commission. And naturally, government finances, and particularly on the GST, because as a Revenue Secretary, I was looking into the GST, and then I was also chairman of the GSTN, and then the secretary of the GST Council. So there, and with Argo was and he rightly said that, the amount of discussion and the brainstorming that I used to have with him, right from my Aadhaar days, and which continued when I became a Revenue Secretary. So once there was an issue about the compensation, that whether the compensation can be paid, shortfall in the compensation can be paid from the Consolidated Fund of India, right? And there, somehow, based on my understanding and reading of law, I said that no, it can't be paid from the Consolidated Fund of India. And then I bounced this idea to him, and he also said that yes, this is the correct position. And then, so I was trying to, because in the department and elsewhere, it was almost like a, because everybody has assumed that any shortfall has to be paid from the Consolidated Fund of India. So anyone saying that, it can't be paid, I think, he will face, he was like something completely gone out of mind. So I mentioned that topic to him. And then he said that, because he's very experienced, he said, okay, have you taken some legal advice? Then I mentioned, said that, I have consulted, taken advice from Argo. They say he's also my advisor. So I said that, once we have a common advisor, there is no problem. Right? Then Justice Sri Krishna also, because why I'm recounting is that, they are the persons with whom I actually worked and carried out many reforms. We worked together on this data protection committee, and then they drafted the data protection bill, which is going through certain stages. I mean, these are the part of the whole process. And that is where, we also had discussed with him on Aadhaar, and where, he gave a very, very good suggestions. And of course, Indu Bhushan, when he joined as in the Ayushman Bharat, then naturally, the linkage with Aadhaar and then how to take it forward. So that was the case. Now, what Arkia, you mentioned about the finance ministry, and then what the books also talks about is that the entire governance structure, because you can't look at the finance ministry in isolation. And this book actually raises a very pertinent point. That is the role of PMO versus, the cabinet secretary versus other ministries also. Because these days, somewhere, you can always see certain reports that the PMO has become very powerful. There is a lot of concentration of power. And that is the kind of an impression that is sought to be created. But what perhaps is not appreciated, and that is what he has actually written in the book, that if you want a reform or if you want to change, then it has to come from a top leadership. And if the top leadership has to involve, and if that leadership is the Prime Minister, then it has to be driven by him. I'll give you certain examples. Whereas the institution of Cabinet Secretary is the stability and continuity. And because this has to be continued from Prime Minister to Prime Minister, and therefore there has to be a certain record keeping, certain continuity has to happen. But so far as the reform or the change or challenging the status quo is concerned, that can come from the Prime Minister's office. And I think I can give you certain examples. All of you must have been exposed to this Aadhaar controversy, right? Particularly the younger lots. Because I saw that it divided my family also. Like, my daughters had a different views, right? And therefore, so particularly the younger ones, they had a very, very different saying that, Aadhaar is a massive breach of privacy. It will lead to surveillance state. All kinds of things happen. You will be monitored and so and so. And right from 2009-10, and I happened to work under both government, that UPA as well as the NDA government, both. And I could see the very distinct change. So far as the top leadership was concerned, in both government, I must say that they were equally committed of bringing Aadhaar, because Aadhaar was brought in the earlier government, right, during the Manmohan Singh regime. But the essential difference that I could find is that the intention was right, but then what was lacked was the execution. Because reform is not only an idea, but actually what you have to execute. And this is exactly what, in this setup, when I came here in 2015, because I moved from Mumbai Aadhaar to, at the national level in 2015, I found that every 3 months, Prime Minister used to take a meeting, call all departments and saying that, what is happening, what is the next, and so and so. And then every month, his office would be after us. And of course, Arghya would know, the way, the kind of thing that we were going through. This, and what was happening is that Aadhaar, I am giving an example, and that will give you an idea that, what is what critical role a Prime Minister office plays, because it's better explained by this example. Now, here was a program of the government, which is, unheard anywhere in the world, of this scale, that, 130 crore people, biometric, deduplication. Today, you all have that. If that scale, and every department had some other identity program, like, the ration card, they had a ration, passport, PAN card, then driver license. The state government all had a different programs. Many of the state government, they were also collecting biometrics. So one was the question of turf, that, look, we are already doing it, then why are you coming? Then, you had a big debate, you must have read in the newspaper, that RGI, right, RGI, Registrar General of India, the national, the citizenship and others. So every department was trying to protect. And here, because Aadhaar was all encompassing, so we were getting an opposition from, more opposition from within than from outside, right? So it was not a question that so in such situation, tell me, that how such reforms, and this story will be true for any other reforms also, because in every reform will upset many, the legacy institutions or legacy schemes, and therefore there will be certain resistance. So now who will have the power? Because is it a departmental issue? Because Aadhaar was earlier with the Planning Commission, later on it was assigned to the IT Ministry of Information Technology. Was it in the capacity of one particular department to handle, the hundreds of other departments, ministry, institutions and the state government? Obviously not. So what it was required was a very, very the institution of Prime Minister's office to step in and actually get it done, right? And once they started stepping in, then the things started falling in place. We got a new act and so and so. Another example, again of this scale, let's say within the finance ministry itself, sir has been a revenue secretary and knows that how difficult, because the tax department, traditionally right from 1860, that the income tax department, just after the crown took over, this income tax department was established. And since then, it has a system of the jurisdictional kind of a collector, commissioners, and so and so. So you had an assistant commissioner, Connaught Place, or deputy commissioner, Mumbai, or Mumbai Dhara, Mumbai Nariman Point. This is, or Kolhapur, the deputy commissioner. And so the entire administration of tax, whether it is the direct tax or indirect tax, was being done through these jurisdictional officers. And all the assessees were kind of filing the tax return there and so and so. So all these systems were all right, at a certain point of time. But with advent of technology, all these boundaries, physical boundaries started getting blurred. And somehow, we did not change that. So when the question arose that how do you reform this, the tax department, then we said that, look, we are living in this, the era of cloud technology. Why can't we have, all your income tax return filed on the cloud, and then and then your tax return can be assigned to any officer, regardless of the place where you are. I mean, you may be in Delhi, but your tax return can be assigned to somebody in Guwahati.
That's right.
And he could do this. So this entire concept of faceless assessment came. And that was a completely, the out of, I would say that completely a tangential, the solution, because it was not a routine solution. So many of these solutions, if you try to, I thought that, if I try to bring this as a revenue secretary, I wouldn't have been successful. But here, if you can, a lot of discussions were held with the PMO, and we could, and after certain discussions, this came.
That's right.
The PLI scheme, again, some of these
That's
schemes,
right.
the recent things that I'm talking about. So therefore, what is required in the system here is that if you want to drive reforms and change, then you require that institution. And one suggestion, in fact, Mr. N.K Singh has mentioned in his book, and has very briefly mentioned that the rules of allocation of business rules. There, it is written very cryptically that Prime Minister's office to assist Prime Minister, the Cabinet Secretary to assist the Cabinet and enforce the rules of business. What happens is that unless and until, and this is my personal opinion, that this also needs to be expanded. Because today what happens is, if a Prime Minister office does it, always, there is some doubt somewhere in the mind that is the Prime Minister office overreaching this, right? Because, there are certain, sometimes, in the newspaper it comes that, look, the Prime Minister office has interfered, right? So, but if we realize that this change is necessary, then the time has come to reflect whether this particular, the assignment or the rule should be expanded, so that, as an institution it could be developed. Today what is doing, but then should there be certain changes in the rules, where you can say that, yes, as a Prime Minister's office, this is what your responsibility is, to drive change, drive reforms, something like that. So if that is the case, otherwise, sometimes, it appears that what they are doing, Prime Minister's office is doing, whether it is a legitimate.
That's right. So maybe we should just put in that allocation of business rules, sub kuch. I think we'll just take it to
30 seconds.
Okay, I want to take it to Prachi actually, because she's been very patiently waiting with this.
But I just follow up. 30
Okay,
seconds.
very quick, very quick.
30 seconds. Sir, you've talked about Prime Minister's office and Cabinet office. But I was wondering, from your long experience, what is the relationship between Prime Minister and Cabinet? Have the cabinets become more and more rubber stamped now? No discussion takes place in Cabinet. How many proposals going to cabinets are rejected, new ideas coming from cabinet. If that is not the case, then probably we are going towards a presidential system.
That's
Number two, what is the role of extensions, sir? It didn't happen till about 10 years ago. Now, if you extend a person the key position, does that change the incentive structure and the way you function?
So maybe we'll just hold those questions, and we'll get Prachi in. Prachi, thank you for being with us for this long and hearing us on and off. I hope you can hear us now, but as an academic, I'm looking to you here because we've covered a wide range of issues in the course of the last hour. And I think if I were to broadly bucket it, it's around the question of institutional reform in two areas, in finance and health, and also institutional reforms in terms of governance on center versus state. You've been both an insider as well as an outsider, and you've read the book and reviewed it. How do you see India and the Indian reform story progressing in the course of the next decade? Prachi.
Thank you very much, Arghya and Vidhi, for giving me the opportunity. Can you hear me?
Very clearly.
Yeah, okay. Because this has been a unique experience because I almost could not hear anything, but I can hear you, but I could not hear the panelists. So I urge Justice Sri Krishna's appeal to recalibrate the audio for next time as well. Let me start by saying that Recalibrate really comes on the back of a truly unprecedented global and domestic backdrop, and that makes it very relevant and pertinent to the current context. Globally, if you think about it, there've been a cascade of crises and shocks. COVID was a truly unprecedented shock where the response to the shock itself triggered a global recessions, and emerging market economies are still, below some distance from output levels predicted by pre-crisis trends. In addition, if you think about it, globalization is actually facing perhaps its biggest trial since the world wars of the 20th century, amid the pandemic, but also amid the war in Ukraine. And in fact, the war in Ukraine has really intensified concerns about fragmentation or the possibility of the world being increasingly bifurcated into blocks. And not surprisingly, India, with its integration to the global economy and increased integration, has not got unscathed. And as if you flash back to the before the pandemic, India's economy was weak in 2019, but appeared to be near a trough. And the economy was starting to look up when the rising tide gave way to the COVID shock. So I think, as we contend with these profound shifts in both globally as well as domestically, I think Recalibrate and, two lifelong administrators and practitioners, come together to really make a convincing case for the need to recalibrate and change paradigms. So with this, background, referring to your, coming to your exact question, which I hope I heard a little bit, let me focus on two main areas and try to bring some evidence to it. One is agriculture and the other is fiscal. I think on agriculture, I felt that, it's really great to hear from the horse's mouth, how agriculture continues to be imperative. And the book also stresses the shift in the emphasis from agricultural production and productivity to enhancing farmers' welfare. And this is a big paradigm change. And let me say that even though agriculture contributes less than 20% of India's GDP, it continues to employ nearly half of its labor force and adds quite meaningfully to India's exports as well. And importantly, it's also important from the point of view of sustainability, which the book focuses on a lot. Agriculture contributes to about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And this is really also an area where government intervention is essential. Why is it essential? Because, they're missing markets in different spheres, such as credit, insurance, information. And, one thing which one does wonder is, given the crucial role of agriculture, what stalls us from achieving some of the set goals? And, agricultural exports from India are notable, it is still, possibly below its immense potential. And if you look at countries, smaller countries like Vietnam and Thailand, they report 2 to 3 times worth of agricultural exports as a share of their economies. So again, the perception from the book, and rightly so, is that it's very complex and deeply entrenched with political economy. And there has been some discussion from what I could hear. It's a state subject, so it's an issue of the seventh schedule of the Indian Constitution as well, with restricted and mostly prescriptive role of the central government and all these intricacies of the center-state relations. With this, let me move on, to the second topic, which is indeed, discussed a lot in the book and which is definitely close to my heart. I think Mr. N.K. Singh, Chairman, Finance Commission, has really been a modernizer in his roles as the chair of the FRBM Review Committee, which I had the privilege to be associated with, and also as the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission. And the book really argues for a fundamental paradigm shift. It talks about the need for a new national debt plan and credible fiscal institutions, such as an independent fiscal council, and the need, which I think again, with Justice Sri Krishna also talked about a little bit, need for a mechanism for parliamentary scrutiny in India's overall fiscal strategy. I should add that this discussion is very relevant at the current juncture, both globally as well as domestically. Globally, you can see what's happening in the United Kingdom, right? I think it's, at the moment, as we speak, we've seen of new developments. Really highlights the importance of this topic, which is at the heart of the book. And domestically, if you look, the COVID-induced surge in India is unique, not only compared to its own history. The COVID-induced surge in debt is unique, not only compared to its own history, but also bigger than that for an average emerging market. And one major cost of debt in India is, and like in many other countries, is the foregone resources on account of strikingly high interest payments. So in India, these comprise about 30% of overall revenues. It's almost 3 times as high as, for a typical emerging market. And so I should say that, indeed, what better time to make a case for fiscal consolidation, for sovereign debt deleveraging, and to rebuild buffers than during a domestic economic recovery cycle like we are going through now, and what we are seeing globally, for instance, in the UK and the ripples it's sending around the globe. So I think, let me conclude by saying that it's, really been a privilege. The book draws on the immense knowledge and experience of the authors, but also amid an unparalleled global and domestic macroeconomic backdrop. And it lays out a very ambitious roadmap for India to transform, to change paradigms, and to achieve an inclusive and sustainable growth for India, but also one that is responsible and efficient. And so I think it's, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I think about it as portraits of reconstruct after Chairman Finance Commission portraits of power. Let me stop here. I hope this went through, because, it's really like a monologue, and apologies if you heard,
It went through perfectly. Thank you. We'll also reconstruct our audio systems and not just recalibrate them. But thank you very much, Prachi. I think from all the panelists, you've heard a wide range of topics being covered, and that's really, it's usually a moderator's nightmare, but that's really testament to the nature of the book and how wide-ranging it is on a number of subjects. Since we have about 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to open it up for questions. There's already one for Mr. Singh from Mr. Bhushan, but if there are any other questions, we'll try and take a couple of questions together and then go ahead, and I have a few as well. Anyone in the audience? Yeah, there's a question right here in front.
My question is for the 3 former civil servants on our panel. So our Prime Minister has time and again expressed the need for Indian institutions to shed their colonial legacy. And we must recognize that the civil service, possibly more than any other institution, was used exclusively as an instrument of colonial oppression. So what has the service done, and what more can it do to recalibrate and shed this colonial legacy?
Maybe, sir, we'll take a couple together, just in the interest of time. If there's any, there's one question right at the back. Oh, there's one here? Yeah. Okay, we'll take one here and then we'll take one at the back. Don't worry, we'll come to you.
So my question is to Dr. Singh. You know, he spoke about the importance of lateral induction and in the civil services, and some of it is happening. So what beyond domain expertise can they actually add?
Okay. Lateral entrance and what they can do, and we'll take one from the back.
Hello. So we are lamps. I believe Sir used to get a lamp when he was a parliamentarian. Going forward, regarding fiscal councils and bodies, should their recommendations be binding or should they be sent to the parliament for ratification? And since we work with the parliament, I also have a question regarding the executive capture of the parliament, like the 80 ordinances or so in the last 8 years. Bills don't get sent to committees often. Amendments, even technical amendments don't get passed. So is the parliament just a rubber stamp for all the bills that the government introduces, and how to solve that? Because, how would we go about that problem? Thank you.
Mr. Singh?
All right.
Maybe the one on the civil service first.
So, you want me to address my answer first to first questioner, Indu?
Sure, please.
So, yes, if I recall it, you want me to comment on the meaningfulness of cabinet discussions. That was your first question, I thought. So let me say this. Why go to India of 2022? I point to you the relevant chapter in Harold Wilson's book, and a Prime Minister on Prime Minister. And please read the chapter that deals with the working of the 10 Downing Street and the Cabinet Office. So, after summing up the discussion within the Cabinet, the book goes on that as the Cabinet Ministers were leaving, the Prime Minister was huddled in a little corner of the room, and one of them was curious to know what was going on. And Wilson replied, "The minutes are being written." But then the cabinet minister said, "But the minutes must reflect really what we have discussed." To that, of course, Harold Wilson replied, "Good God, whoever gave you the impression that the minutes must reflect what was discussed a few minutes ago? The minutes must reflect not what was discussed, but the minutes must reflect what was supposed to be discussed." So that much as far as the meaningfulness of cabinet discussions and cabinet meetings are concerned. Now, I think that you posed a second question. Let me put it this way to you. I agree with you that extensions cannot become the order of the day. Extensions must be merit-based, and it is expected that the Cabinet Secretary, in discussions with the Prime Minister's office, because extensions are granted by the Appointments Committee of the Cabinet. The Appointments Committee of the Cabinet is headed by the Prime Minister and the members of the Appointments Committee, and the Cabinet Secretary is the repository of that. And therefore, I think that extensions must be an exception and cannot be the rule. Public purpose must be the overriding reason why a decision on extensions must be taken. So I think that that's really my view. Whether it quells your curiosity, I will abstain from commenting on that. There was this question which you asked about Parliament. First, which one you want me to take up?
Let's go with the Parliament.
Well, let me say this, that if I were to say, hypothetically speaking, what are the two important pending reforms of India which really need fundamental change? One is a reform of the functioning of parliament and parliamentary institutions. I have commented earlier that Prachi has been a vociferous, articulate, persuasive arguments for fiscal institutions, independent fiscal institutions. And that's something which the questioner also hinted, or what should be the role of the fiscal council. Let me say that in my own experience of working of 6 years in Parliament, and I have mentioned this in an interaction elsewhere, Parliament's knowledge on fiscal matters is next to negligible. Parliament's appetite at being educated on fiscal issues is close to zero. So how does one bring about improved superintendence of Parliament over the executive, which you pointed out as one of the questions? First of all, by acquiring domain skills. How is that to be done? I would point out to you at the subject to the allegation of not promoting my earlier book, but I prompt to you a chapter written on reforms of Parliament in my earlier autobiography. And in the shortage of time, I would urge you to perhaps read that. I have made some tangible suggestions on how working of Parliament and parliamentary institutions can be improved. And as you rightly pointed out, that parliamentary superintendence over the working of the executive become more meaningful. Stop at that. Fiscal institutions can only be advisory, they cannot be binding. But the quality of the advice is what matters. And if it is therefore, if decisions are taken with improved domain understanding, it will improve the quality of the decisions. The first question, I think that was...
Civil service, heading colonial bank.
Well, let me say this, that the colonial civil servant was called the Indian Civil Service. A fundamental change, because that's what was created. It was earlier called the Imperial Service. The Imperial Service was then changed to the Indian Civil Service. And the abolition of the Indian Civil Service was replaced by the Indian Administrative Service. Now, it is true that that has, over a period of time, served a valuable purpose. Because can you think of suppose you tomorrow abolish the Indian Administrative Service. Suppose I asked you the hypothetical question. And are you wanting the abolition of a permanent civil service? Then to be replaced by what kind of an arrangement? With changes which are frequently taking place on the political arena, who would look after the continuity in the maintenance of security of life and property, in ensuring compliance with the rules, regulations, and the constitutional propriety? So therefore, I think you require changes which adapt to the needs of the time. And I would be the first votary to say that the quality of domain understanding and knowledge within the civil service establishment needs to be improved. And something which I said earlier per se, which I will emphasize, and something that I'm sure that Ajay would agree with me, is that technology is going to play an exceedingly important role. Look, for instance, the alacrity with which a small event in a remote village, perhaps in Orissa or in Bihar, receives the focus on account of technology in real time to drawing the attention. So I think technology, improving our domain knowledge, will improve the accountability of the civil service establishment. It is improved quality of accountability and not the abolition of that process, which I would plead for.
Can I just add to what you In fact, about the civil service reforms. In fact, the book title is Recalibrate. The civil service also, in my view, requires certain recalibration because it can't go on. I mean, it has.
Hy don't you, Ajay,
Yes.
since he is encouraged to asking cross questions, write a book, Recalibrate the Civil Service?
Yes. So about the civil service, because it has served for some time and has been of certain utility. But in this changing time today, as has been mentioned here, that it requires certain, with changing time, technology, and then domain expertise. So the people need to upgrade themselves. So the idea of the lateral entry is being gradually accepted. But along with that, somewhere the lateral exit also should happen. In the sense that it shouldn't happen that entire civil service should be like a pipe where you enter as a probationer and you finally retire as a secretary to Government of India, right? So what happens, because unless and until you have that, after every 5 years or 10 years, right, some kind of a Agnipath kind of a scheme, right? Because this issue was there. So somewhere, some kind of a, because we have been right from the time when I joined civil service about 30 years back. Since then, the people have been talking about the increasing your domain knowledge, keeping yourself abreast, and then in fact I personally took that very seriously. After 14 years of my service in IAS, I thought that I will take a study leave, and I went to US, and what subject I tried to do a specialization in computer science. People thought that maybe I've gone out of my mind, right? Then an IAS officer, after 14 years of service, says that I will study computer science. That was way back in 1998, because I was seeing the writing on the wall that someday this technology will come. The internet was just coming up. So I said I will do MS in computer science, and then I liked that subject so much that I said I will do PhD in computer science. So I ended up doing PhD in computer science. And just see, when I came back to India, I mean, I thought that maybe the government will use me for the information technology department and so. But then they made me Secretary of Women and Child. So all my colleagues said that, look, he served you well.
But by the way, by the way, government wakes with a lag. But in his case, Rip Van Winkle didn't exist forever because he was made the head of the unique identification, and we owe the Aadhaar to him.
So then what happened was, then I spent about 5-6 years, I was in the power sector, and then finally I landed up in the UIDI after 6 or 7 years of my PhD, the Aadhaar project. There I continued for 9 years. And then suddenly this problem of GST technology came, GST, and I was also made the chairman. So I could use my full knowledge of technology and the policy, and then I could be I could do something about it. So the whole idea is that every civil servant, today they live in a comfort zone. That once you have cleared one examination, then your life is secured, right? And therefore, what is the incentive for doing a constant self-improvement and then domain and other things? So therefore, some kind of a recalibration with the lateral entry and then the lateral exit. Those who do not calibrate themselves, right? That's right. They need to laterally exit.
That's right. I think that's a great note to close this on. I think we've gone a bit over because this discussion has been so enriching. Thank you very much, Mr. Singh, for writing this book and for being here to discuss it. I strongly encourage that everyone buys a copy of this book. It's a very easy read, and this is something that I certainly encourage everyone to do. Thank you very much particularly to Justice Sri Krishna and Prachi. I'm very sorry again for the audio troubles that we've had, but thank you very much for so patiently bearing with us and sharing your thoughts. And so thank you, sir. I can see you again, but thank you very much for being with us, and to Prachi with the time difference. I really appreciate it. And to Dr. Bhushan and Dr. Pandey, as always, my deepest gratitude and appreciation. And last but not the least, thank you to the audience for coming here on this pre-Diwali night. We have a small token of appreciation for our guests here. Justice Sri Krishna and Prachi, subject to you giving an India address, we will be able to send these to you as well very, very shortly, hopefully in time for Diwali. So a small thank you to Mr. Singh. To Dr. Bhushan and to Dr. Pandey. Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody and wish you all a very happy Diwali.
Namaste, namaste.
Thank you, Arghya.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.